From her teenage years, Prisca commanded attention wherever she went in the bustling streets of Lagos. Pedestrians paused mid-step. Taxi drivers slowed down. Street vendors forgot their sales pitches. Her beauty wasn't merely attractive. It possessed an almost ethereal quality that seemed to separate her from ordinary mortals. By age 20, her reputation had spread across Victoria Island and Lekki. Young professionals debated about her in corporate offices. Mothers discussed her at salon appointments. Younger girls simultaneously envied and feared her presence. Even committed men found themselves caught in her magnetic pull. However, Prisca wasn't celebrated for compassion. She had built a reputation on arrogance and possessed a heart seemingly carved from granite. The morning sun barely touched the Lagos skyline when Prisca emerged from her family's luxury apartment in Ikoyi. She wore a fitted burgundy dress that accentuated her tall, slender frame. Her complexion gleamed under the early rays like burnished copper. Her professionally styled hair cascaded down her shoulders like royalty. She moved deliberately, fully aware that eyes followed her every gesture. And they did. Shop owners paused their morning routines. Security guards straightened their uniforms. Young men on motorcycles nearly caused accidents craning their necks. Women in their cars stared through tinted windows, some with admiration, others with barely concealed envy. Prisca absorbed it all like oxygen, her chin perpetually tilted upward, her gaze fixed somewhere above the heads of ordinary people. At the forgotten edge of Surulere, where gleaming high-rises surrendered to modest structures and narrow alleys, resided an elderly woman named Auntie Folake. She had no spouse, no offspring, no extended family. She survived alone in a tiny one-room apartment with peeling paint and a leaking roof, subsisting on menial cleaning jobs at office complexes and occasional charity from kinder neighbors. Some residents of the building suspected she carried bad luck. Others claimed she had once been a renowned traditional healer before embracing solitude and silence. Auntie Folake rarely engaged with anyone. She moved like a phantom through the chaotic Lagos streets, departing before dawn for her cleaning jobs, returning long after sunset to her cramped space. When greeted, she acknowledged politely with a slight nod before continuing her path. Young people avoided her, creating exaggerated distance when passing. Adults sympathized but kept their distance, afraid that whatever misfortune clung to her might prove contagious. Nobody truly understood her story, and she appeared content with anonymity, as if she'd made peace with invisibility long ago. That sweltering afternoon, Lagos' humidity pressed down like a suffocating blanket. Dust from nearby construction sites coated everything: cars, buildings, skin. The air tasted of exhaust fumes and street food. Prisca had visited her friend Chioma's boutique in Yaba, spending 2 hours trying on clothes she had no intention of buying, enjoying the shop attendant's flattery and desperate attempts to please her. Now she was returning alone to Ikoyi, swinging her designer handbag carelessly, chin elevated as always, her heels clicking against the cracked pavement with deliberate rhythm. Simultaneously, Auntie Folake was heading back from her afternoon cleaning job at a 3-story office building where she scrubbed toilets and mopped floors for people who never learned her name. She carried a worn plastic bucket containing her cleaning supplies, a nearly empty bottle of bleach, tattered rags, a broken scrub brush she'd salvaged from trash. Her posture was bent from years of hard labor, her steps measured and slow, each one seeming to require tremendous effort. The narrow pedestrian walkway in Yaba barely accommodated 2 people side by side. On one side, vendors had encroached with their stalls. On the other, parked motorcycles created additional obstacles. The space between was a tight corridor that forced people into uncomfortable proximity. When Auntie Folake spotted Prisca approaching from the opposite direction, she halted immediately. The elderly woman had heard the stories whispered in markets and bus stops. She understood Prisca's temperament, proud and explosively quick to anger, especially toward those she considered beneath her. Wanting no confrontation, wanting only to complete her journey home to her small room where she could finally rest her aching bones, she moved aside, pressing her frail body against a concrete wall, making herself as small and invisible as possible. Prisca passed without acknowledgement, without even a flicker of awareness that another human being had moved aside for her convenience. The old woman lowered her gaze to the dusty ground, remained silent, and prepared to continue her journey. But then, wait. The command was sharp as broken glass, cutting through the ambient noise of Lagos traffic. Auntie Folake stopped, her heart suddenly beating faster. Did I dismiss you? Prisca turned slowly, her movements theatrical, designed for maximum effect. The elderly woman pivoted back, confusion spreading across her weathered face like clouds covering the sun. My dear, I didn't disturb you. I simply moved aside. Prisca examined her from head to toe, with the kind of scrutiny one might give to a piece of rotten fruit in the market, her lips curling with visible disgust. So, because you're elderly, you believe you can pass me without proper acknowledgement? Without greeting? Without showing respect? The old woman bowed slightly, her bucket handle cutting into her calloused palm. Forgive me, I intended no offense. I only wanted to let you pass comfortably. But Prisca wasn't satisfied. Something in her, perhaps boredom, perhaps cruelty, perhaps the need to remind herself of her own importance, demanded more. She advanced closer, invading the elderly woman's space. Do you understand who I am? She demanded, her voice rising loud enough for nearby hawkers and passers-by to hear. Auntie Folake stayed silent, her eyes fixed on a spot somewhere near Prisca's expensive shoes. I am Prisca Adelique, the young woman declared proudly, as if announcing royalty. When I pass through these streets, people stop what they're doing. They acknowledge my presence. They demonstrate proper respect. That's how it works. That's the natural order of things. The elderly woman's voice remained calm despite her racing heart. Respect isn't demanded, my child. It's something earned through character and kindness. Those words ignited something volcanic in Prisca. Her expression darkened like a storm gathering over the Atlantic. Her perfectly made-up face twisted into something ugly. What did you just say to me? Auntie Folake shook her head gently, already regretting her honesty. I apologize if I've offended you. That wasn't my intention. But Prisca had already decided on public humiliation. She'd already chosen to make an example of this insignificant old woman who dared to speak to her about earning respect. See this worn-out body? Prisca announced loudly, gesturing dramatically so that the growing crowd of onlookers, hawkers abandoning their wares, motorcycle taxi drivers cutting their engines, office workers pausing on their way home, could witness her performance. This is what happens when someone wastes their entire existence. No husband to care for her. No children to support her old age. No decent home worth mentioning. Just this pathetic existence, cleaning other people's dirt. The elderly woman flinched, as if physically struck. Prisca continued, her voice dripping with contempt, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. You move through these streets like a ghost that nobody notices. Nobody acknowledges you. Nobody values you. Nobody would miss you if you disappeared tomorrow. Even death probably waits for you in disappointment, wondering why it should bother claiming such a worthless life. Auntie Folake's hands trembled violently around her bucket handle. The plastic cut into her skin. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the traffic. Please just let me pass. Let me go home. But Prisca blocked her path, positioning her designer-clad body as an impenetrable barrier. Look at me when I address you, she shouted, loud enough for people 2 blocks away to hear. When someone speaks to you, you look at them. It's called basic respect, something you clearly never learned. Slowly, with tremendous effort, Auntie Folake raised her eyes from the ground. And within them wasn't anger or hatred. It was profound, soul-deep pain. The kind of pain that comes from a lifetime of invisibility, of being overlooked and undervalued. Prisca laughed harshly, a sound without warmth or humor. See her face, wrinkled like crushed newspaper someone threw in the gutter. See her clothes, rags that even beggars would reject. If you'd made better choices in life, if you'd been smarter, prettier, more ambitious, perhaps you wouldn't end like this. Perhaps you'd matter to someone. The usual chaotic symphony of Lagos, honking horns, shouting vendors, rumbling generators, seemed to fade into background static. For a moment, the world held its breath, as if nature itself was appalled. Auntie Folake straightened her bent spine with difficulty, vertebrae crackling in protest. Her voice, when it emerged, was no longer frail or apologetic. Beauty without compassion is a curse, not a blessing. Prisca scoffed, tossing her hair dramatically. Who are you to lecture me? Who are you to speak to me about curses and blessings? You're nobody. You're nothing. The elderly woman took a measured step forward, no longer shrinking, no longer making herself small. You've been given much, child, beauty, youth, privilege. But you wield these gifts like weapons to crush others beneath you. Today, you've chosen to wound someone who meant you absolutely no harm, who only wanted to go home after a long day of honest work. Prisca folded her arms across her chest, her designer bracelets jangling. So, what will you do about it? Cry? Report me to someone? Who would listen to you? Auntie Folake looked directly into her eyes with a gaze that seemed to pierce through expensive makeup and designer clothes to see something deeper. No, she said quietly but with absolute conviction. I will speak truth into your life. The air suddenly felt oppressive, heavy with something intangible but undeniably present. Even the constant Lagos noise seemed to diminish, as if the city itself was leaning in to listen. Auntie Folake raised her trembling, work-worn hand toward the sky. As you've used your beauty to bring shame and suffering to others, it shall become the primary source of your own suffering. Prisca laughed, but the sound carried a nervous edge. You think you can frighten me with dramatic words? You think I believe in your village superstitions? The elderly woman's voice deepened, taking on a quality that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. You will experience profound loneliness though the world pursues you relentlessly. You will taste true deprivation though wealth surrounds you constantly. You will cry desperately for genuine love, yet none will remain by your side. Your beauty will become your prison. Your pride will become your isolation. And only when your heart genuinely learns humility, not performative humility, but true transformation, will your burden finally lift. For the first time in her life, Prisca felt something unfamiliar crawling up her spine, not quite fear, but profound, unsettling unease. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry despite the humidity. You're insane. You're a crazy old woman who cleans toilets for a living. Auntie Folake lowered her hand slowly. I have spoken what needs to be spoken, she said softly, her voice returning to its normal frail quality. The rest is now between you and your own choices. Then she picked up her bucket, stepped around Prisca's designer-clad form, and walked away down the crowded Lagos street without another glance backward, disappearing into the flow of humanity like water into sand. Prisca stood alone in the middle of the pedestrian walkway as the crowd that had gathered began to disperse. Traffic resumed its chaos. People hurried past, some glancing at her curiously, others deliberately avoiding eye contact. Life returned to its normal frenetic rhythm. She shook her head and laughed uncomfortably, trying to reclaim her composure. Foolish old woman, she muttered to herself, loud enough for nearby people to hear. Crazy talk from a crazy person. But somewhere deep within her chest, in a place she'd never examined or acknowledged, something had fundamentally shifted. A tiny crack had appeared in the armor of her certainty. She didn't realize it yet, but the curse, whether supernatural or simply the natural consequence of cruelty meeting its reckoning, had already taken root. That night, Prisca lay in her comfortable king-sized bed in her family's luxury Ikoyi apartment, surrounded by silk pillows and expensive linens, staring at her bedroom ceiling where shadows from passing headlights created moving patterns. Sleep refused to come despite her exhaustion. Her mind replayed the elderly woman's words endlessly, like a song stuck on repeat. Beauty without compassion is a curse. She turned to her side, hugging a pillow. Nonsense, she whispered into the darkness. Superstitious nonsense from an uneducated woman. But when she finally drifted into unconscious, her dreams weren't peaceful. She saw herself walking through Victoria Island as usual, beautiful, perfectly dressed, commanding attention. But in the dream, people stared with hollow, empty eyes. Men reached for her with desperate hands, but when they made contact with her skin, they recoiled violently as if burned. She attempted to speak, to explain herself, to demand the respect she was owed, but no sound emerged from her moving lips. She was screaming silently, while the world watched with dead eyes. She woke at 3 a.m. screaming loud enough to wake her parents in the adjacent room. Her father knocked urgently. "Prisca? Are you all right?" "Just a nightmare," she called back, her voice shaking. "Just a bad dream." "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Within days, unusual marks began appearing on her skin, dark patches that seemed to emerge from beneath the surface like bruises, but they didn't hurt when pressed. They weren't disfiguring enough to make her unrecognizable, but they were sufficient to steal the flawless perfection she'd always possessed and taken for granted. She tried everything. Expensive dermatologists in Victoria Island examined her with furrowed brows and prescribed creams that did nothing. She visited medical spas in Lekki that promised miracle treatments. She spent a small fortune on imported skincare products ordered from Dubai. Nothing worked. The marks remained, slowly spreading like spilled ink on cloth. Her suitors began hesitating in ways they never had before. Men still noticed her. Her fundamental beauty remained, but they no longer spoke with the certainty of desire. Their eyes would linger on the dark patches, questions forming behind their gazes. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt forced, punctuated by uncomfortable silences. Her friends, the carefully curated circle of beautiful, privileged young women who'd surrounded her like satellites orbiting a planet, started avoiding her. Invitations to beach parties in Lekki dried up. Her calls went unreturned. Her messages were left unread. Some whispered behind her back in shopping malls and restaurants, their conversations falling silent when she approached, resuming in hushed tones when she passed. Prisca returned to her apartment one evening after a particularly humiliating day. A former suitor had literally crossed the street to avoid greeting her, rage and confusion boiling within her like a toxic stew. Her father, a successful businessman who'd built his fortune through hard work and shrewd investments, looked at her with concern deepening the lines around his eyes. "My daughter, what's happening to you? Should we travel abroad for better medical treatment?" She said nothing. Words felt too heavy to lift. She locked herself in her room and confronted the full-length mirror that had always been her ally, her validation. "Fix this," she whispered desperately to her reflection, pressing her palms against the cool glass. "Please fix this." But the mirror offered no answers, only the truth of her changing appearance staring back with eyes that seemed to accuse. Far away, in her humble Surrey apartment with its leaking roof and perpetually broken fan, Ani Folake sat by her small window watching the sunset paint Lagos in shades of orange and purple. She closed her eyes and for the first time in many years, tears rolled down her weathered cheeks, not tears of vindictiveness, but tears of sorrow for a young woman who'd chosen pride over compassion, cruelty over kindness. "May she learn before it's too late," the old woman whispered to the empty room. "May she discover her humanity before her beauty destroys her completely." For the first time in her life, Prisca woke afraid of facing the morning. She lay motionless on her expensive mattress, listening to the familiar sounds of Lagos waking up, generators coughing to life, cars honking in early traffic jams, street vendors beginning their daily calls. Normally, she would rise with confidence, knowing the world would stop for her, pause in appreciation. But now her heart raced with anxiety, her palms sweated despite the air conditioning. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned toward the vanity mirror beside her bed, the one she'd positioned specifically to catch her reflection first thing each morning. What she saw made her breath catch painfully in her chest. The dark marks had spread significantly overnight. Not like wounds, not like any disease the expensive doctors could identify. They were strange, smooth patches on her once flawless skin, like shadows that didn't belong, as if darkness from inside her was seeping outward. Her eyes remained striking, her lips still full and perfectly shaped, her bone structure still dramatic, but the seamless perfection was gone. The thing that had made her not just beautiful, but otherworldly, had vanished like smoke. And Prisca knew instinctively this wasn't ordinary. This wasn't something medical science could explain or fix. She pressed her fingers against her cheek, feeling the smooth texture of the dark patches. "Go away," she whispered desperately, as if words alone could reverse whatever was happening. "Please go away." Nothing happened. The reflection continued staring back with accusing eyes. She slammed her hand against the mirror, creating a sharp crack that spiderwebbed across her reflected face. "This is madness," she said to herself, her voice breaking. That old woman, she did something. She spoke some kind of curse. For the first time in her 20 years of existence, Prisca felt genuinely powerless. All her life, her beauty had been a superpower, opening doors, creating opportunities, bending people to her will. Now that power was draining away like water through cupped hands, and she had no idea how to function without it. She wrapped herself in her finest outfit before stepping out of the house, a designer ensemble that had cost more than many Lagosians earned in months, paired with jewelry that caught sunlight and threw it in brilliant fragments. She expected the same familiar reactions despite her changing appearance. She desperately needed those reactions. She didn't get them. At the first junction outside her family's compound, two young professional men stood waiting for an Uber, both dressed in sharp suits for their office jobs. Normally, they would have jumped to attention, competing for her notice, trying desperately to engage her in conversation. Today they only looked up briefly, their eyes registering her presence before sliding away to their phones. One whispered something to the other. Neither of them smiled. Prisca stopped directly in front of them, blocking their view of the street. "Do you not see me standing here?" she snapped, hearing the desperation in her own voice. The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Good morning, Ma," one said awkwardly, his tone polite but distant, the way you'd greet any stranger. Prisca waited, her chest tight with expectation. Nothing more came. No admiration glowing in their eyes. No excitement coloring their voices. No fear of offending her. Just polite, distant acknowledgement of another human being sharing the same sidewalk. She walked on, her expensive heels clicking against pavement that suddenly felt less like her domain and more like hostile territory. At the shopping complex in Victoria Island where she'd spent countless hours browsing designer stores, saleswomen who used to rush forward with enthusiastic greetings now watched from safe distances. Some whispered to colleagues behind cupped hands. Some shook their heads with expressions that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "Pride always gets humbled eventually," she heard one woman mutter to another as she passed. She was too proud. "Now see what's happening to her," another voice agreed. Prisca clenched her fists so hard her expensive manicure cut into her palms. She passed a group of younger girls, university students who once followed her like devoted disciples, studying her style, copying her mannerisms. Now they stared as if she were a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when beauty fades. One of them laughed quietly, covering her mouth, but not quickly enough. The sound cut through Prisca like a blade dipped in acid. She rushed back to her car, her breath coming in short gasps that felt like suffocation. Once safely inside, with tinted windows creating a barrier between her and the cruel world, she stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. And for the first time in her life, Prisca cried. Not delicate, photogenic tears, but ugly, desperate sobs that shook her entire body. Makeup ran down her changing face in dark streams. "Why is this happening to me?" she shouted into the empty car, her voice raw with anguish. What did I do to deserve this? But she knew the answer. Somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of denial and pride, she knew exactly what she'd done. She'd spent years wielding her beauty like a weapon, crushing people beneath her words, treating human beings like insects unworthy of basic respect. No one answered her question. The car remained silent except for her ragged breathing and broken sobs. Among Prisca's many admirers was a successful tech entrepreneur named David. He had been the most persistent of them all, the most determined to win her attention and affection. He brought expensive gifts, designer handbags from Milan, jewelry from Cartier, weekend trips to Dubai that she accepted without gratitude. He had approached her father formally about marriage, promising a life of luxury that would rival anything she'd known. His proposal had included a bride price that made even her wealthy father's eyebrows rise. Prisca had never given him a definitive answer. She enjoyed his attention and resources. She enjoyed knowing she could make him wait indefinitely, could dangle hope like a carrot while he performed like a trained animal desperate for treats. That afternoon, David arrived at her family's compound in his Range Rover, dressed in expensive casual wear, carrying yet another gift, a limited edition handbag she'd mentioned wanting weeks ago. He wore his usual confident smile, but his eyes examined her face more carefully than before, lingering on the dark marks that now decorated her formerly perfect skin. "My beautiful Prisca, I've missed seeing you," he said, but the word beautiful sounded forced, as if he was trying to convince himself. She stood tall, fighting to maintain her usual haughty posture. "Then why are you looking at me like that?" "Like what?" he asked, though they both knew exactly what she meant. "Like I'm something strange. Like I've become something repulsive that you can barely stand to see." David shifted uncomfortably, the expensive handbag dangling forgotten from his hand. "I care deeply for you, Prisca. You know that. But people are talking all over Lagos. They're saying strange things are happening to you. They're saying you're changing." Prisca's eyes flashed with anger and fear. "And you believe them? You believe gossip from people who are jealous of what we have." He replied softly, choosing words carefully, like someone navigating a minefield. "I believe what I can see with my own eyes. Something is different. Something has changed." Silence fell between them like a physical barrier. The compound's garden, usually filled with sounds of birds and insects, seemed to hold its breath. Prisca took a step backward, creating distance. "So now you also look at me with doubt? With suspicion? After everything I've allowed you to do for me?" David sighed deeply, setting the expensive handbag on a nearby bench. "I only want to understand what's happening. I want to help you if I can. But you have to let me in, Prisca. You have to tell me what's going on." "Then leave," she said coldly, the words emerging sharp and final. "If you can't accept me exactly as I am right now, then leave." He looked at her, genuine pain visible in his eyes despite the confusion. "I never thought you would speak to me this way. I've loved you even when you treated me like I was nothing. Even when you humiliated me in front of your friends. Even when you accepted my gifts and gave nothing in return." Prisca laughed bitterly, a sound without humor. "Love? You loved my beauty. That's all any of you ever loved. My face, my body, my appearance. You never cared about who I actually am inside, because none of you ever bothered to look that deep." David opened his mouth to respond, to protest, but no words came, because somewhere in his heart, he knew she was right. He had loved the idea of possessing her beauty, of having the most desired woman in Lagos on his arm like a trophy. He turned slowly and walked away, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. Prisca watched his back disappear down the road, watched his Range Rover pull away with its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. For the first time in her existence, someone had left her. Not because she rejected them, but because something about her was no longer sufficient. Her beauty, the only currency she'd ever known, was devaluing before her eyes. She sank onto the ground right there in the compound, her expensive designer dress pooling around her like a deflated balloon, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. That night, the nightmares returned with increased intensity. This time the dream was crystalline in its clarity and cruelty. Prisca stood in the middle of Victoria Island dressed in the finest clothes money could buy, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and privilege. Her skin glowed with impossible perfection, restored beyond even its former beauty. Men literally knelt before her. Women bowed in acknowledgement. Children sang her name like a prayer. She smiled. She lifted her chin in familiar triumph. She prepared to speak words of command. And then the earth beneath her expensive heels cracked open like an egg. She began sinking slowly, inevitably, into the widening fissure. She screamed for help, her voice finally working, echoing across the dreamscape. No one moved. They only watched with empty eyes, their previous adoration evaporating like morning mist. As she fell deeper into darkness, she saw Auntie Folake standing at the edge of the pit, her elderly face calm, her eyes filled with profound sorrow rather than satisfaction. "Why?" Prisca cried desperately, clawing at crumbling earth. "Why are you doing this to me?" "You chose pride over compassion," the old woman said, her voice echoing impossibly. "You chose cruelty over kindness. You chose appearance over substance. These were your choices, child, not mine." Prisca reached out desperately, her fingers grasping air. "Help me. Please help me." Mama Folake shook her head slowly. "Transform your heart first. Only then will the chains break. Only then will you stop falling." Prisca awoke violently at 4 a.m., her chest heaving like she'd run a marathon, her bed soaked with sweat despite the air conditioning running at full blast. Her scream had been loud enough to wake her parents again. This time her father entered the room without knocking, his face creased with worry. "Prisca, this is the third night. We need to take you to see someone. A doctor, a therapist, anyone who can help." She sat up shaking, tears streaming down her changing face. "It's not medical, Daddy. It's not something a doctor can fix." "Then what is it?" he demanded, sitting beside her on the bed. "Tell me what's happening to my daughter." She buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled. "I don't know how to explain it. I don't know how to make it stop." But somewhere deep in her consciousness, beneath layers of denial and fear, she knew exactly how to make it stop. She just didn't know if she was capable of what would be required. As days blurred into weeks, the curse, or consequence, or karmic reckoning, or whatever name fit best, didn't stop at her deteriorating beauty. Things began going catastrophically wrong throughout her life, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Her father's successful real estate business, which had thrived for decades, suddenly began hemorrhaging money. Major clients canceled contracts without explanation. A luxury development project in Lekki collapsed when investors mysteriously withdrew. Construction materials went missing from job sites. Government officials who'd been friendly suddenly became hostile, demanding bribes that multiplied beyond reason. Her expensive designer clothes began tearing inexplicably, seams splitting during normal wear, fabrics developing holes overnight. Her imported jewelry tarnished despite proper storage. Her smartphone, barely 6 months old, stopped working. Her laptop crashed, taking years of photos with it. Even food in their well-stocked kitchen seemed to spoil faster than natural decay could explain. One evening, Prisca's father sat silently in their luxury living room, his usually confident face etched with worry lines that seemed to have appeared overnight. "We're losing everything," he said quietly, staring at financial documents spread across the coffee table. "Clients who've worked with me for 20 years are suddenly going elsewhere. I don't understand it. Nothing makes sense anymore." Prisca listened from the doorway, fear crawling up her spine like cold fingers. She who had never worried about tomorrow, who had never known genuine lack, was watching her safety net dissolve. That night, she went to their storehouse, a climate-controlled room that usually overflowed with imported foods, expensive wines, delicacies from around the world. Now it looked half-empty, the shelves showing gaps like missing teeth. Her stomach twisted as the old woman's words echoed, "You'll taste deprivation though wealth surrounds you." Prisca dropped to her knees on the cold tile floor, her hands pressed against her face. "No, this cannot become my life. This cannot be my reality." But denial couldn't change the truth unfolding around her. In desperation, Prisca decided to seek help from every source imaginable. Not from her former friends, most of whom had abandoned her like passengers fleeing a sinking ship. Not from her admirers who now avoided her. She went first to a renowned pastor in Lekki who specialized in breaking curses and spiritual warfare. The church was massive, modern, filled with desperate people seeking miraculous solutions. She waited 3 hours for a private consultation. When her turn came, she explained everything: the encounter with Auntie Folake, the old woman's words, the marks spreading across her skin, the nightmares that stole her sleep, the strange cascade of misfortune. The pastor listened quietly, his expression grave. He prayed over her, anointed her with oil, declared warfare against spiritual attacks. He gave her water that had been blessed during all-night prayer sessions. Nothing changed. The marks remained. The dreams continued. The deterioration of her life accelerated. Next, she visited an exclusive dermatology clinic in Victoria Island where wealthy Lagosians went for aesthetic miracles. The German-trained doctor examined her under bright lights with expensive equipment, took blood samples, performed tests that cost more than many people's monthly salary. His diagnosis: idiopathic hyperpigmentation of unknown origin. I've never seen anything quite like this. His treatments, creams, procedures, laser therapy, accomplished nothing except emptying her dwindling bank account. She went to a traditional herbalist in Badagry, an elderly Yoruba man who claimed to communicate with ancestors and spirits. He prepared foul-smelling potions. He drew elaborate symbols on her skin with white chalk. He burned leaves and made her inhale smoke until she coughed violently. He chanted in languages she didn't understand. Nothing changed except she developed a rash from one of his remedies. Prisca returned to her family's compound more broken than before, the weight of failure crushing her spirit. She tried everything except the one thing that might actually work: genuine transformation of her heart. One sweltering afternoon, Prisca walked toward a shopping complex in Victoria Island, desperately needing to feel like her old self, needing to reclaim some sense of normalcy. On the narrow sidewalk, a young woman carrying shopping bags approached from the opposite direction. In the old days, the woman would have immediately stepped aside, creating space, acknowledging Prisca's superiority through automatic deference. This time, she didn't move. They nearly collided, shopping bags brushing together. "Watch where you're going," the woman said sharply, irritation clear in her voice. Prisca stared in disbelief, old patterns dying hard. "Do you know who I am?" she asked automatically, the words emerging from muscle memory. The woman looked her up and down with undisguised disdain, her gaze lingering deliberately on the dark marks now covering Prisca's face. "I see exactly who you are, someone who thinks the world should part for her like the Red Sea. And I'm telling you, I will not move." She brushed past, deliberately bumping Prisca's shoulder. Prisca stood frozen on the crowded sidewalk, pedestrians flowing around her like water around a stone. The world spun slightly. The ground beneath her expensive shoes felt unsteady, as if Lagos itself was rejecting her presence. This was her life now. No one feared her. No one worshipped her. No one stepped aside. She had become ordinary. Worse than ordinary, she had become invisible, irrelevant. That night, Prisca sat alone in her bedroom while her father worked late, desperately trying to salvage his collapsing business. The house felt empty despite its size, silent despite Lagos's constant noise filtering through windows. She stared at the wall, her mind empty of thought, floating in a space between denial and acceptance. For the first time, she felt the crushing weight of every insult she'd ever thrown, every person she'd shoved aside without thought, every greeting she'd deliberately ignored, every cruelty she'd inflicted for entertainment. She remembered the expression in Auntie Folake's eyes during their confrontation. Not anger, pain. Deep, soul-level pain inflicted by careless words from someone who'd never known suffering. Prisca's throat tightened painfully. "I didn't mean to be that cruel," she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking. "I didn't understand what I was doing." But the room offered no absolution, no comfort, no answers. She curled into herself on her bed, designer sheets that suddenly felt rough against her changing skin. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not angry tears of frustration, but lonely tears of someone finally recognizing their own isolation. She realized then with devastating clarity that she had never truly had a friend, never truly loved anyone, never truly cared about another human being's well-being. Her beauty had always stood between her and genuine connection, like bulletproof glass. She could see through it, but nothing could truly touch her heart. And now that her beauty was fading like a photograph left in sunlight, she had nothing to stand on. No foundation of character, no reservoir of kindness, no history of compassion. She was alone in a way that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with the wasteland where her heart should have been. 2 weeks later, after another night of terrifying dreams where she drowned in darkness while Lagos watched without helping, Prisca made a decision that surprised even herself. She dressed simply, no designer clothes, no expensive jewelry, nothing to broadcast wealth or status. Just plain clothes that could belong to anyone. She left her family's compound quietly at dawn while her father slept fitfully, his own stress manifesting in insomnia. She took public transportation for the first time in years, Danfo buses that smelled of sweat and exhaust, where passengers pressed against each other in uncomfortable intimacy. Nobody recognized her. Nobody gave her special treatment. She was just another tired Lagosian navigating the city's chaos. She walked toward Surulere, toward the forgotten edge, where modest structures surrendered to even more modest ones, toward the small apartment with peeling paint where an elderly woman lived alone. Her steps were slow, her heart pounding with emotions she couldn't name. What if Ani Folek refused to see her? What if the curse was permanent, irreversible? What if she destroyed her only chance at redemption? But something inside her whispered that this was her only path forward. Pride battled desperately with necessity, but for the first time in her life, necessity won. The small apartment building came into view. Cracked concrete walls, rust-stained window frames, laundry hanging from balconies. The kind of place she'd never noticed before, would have looked through as if it were invisible. Prisca stopped several steps away from Auntie Folek's door, her courage faltering. Her pride made one last stand, screaming that she shouldn't be here, that this was beneath her, that there must be another way. She swallowed hard and stepped forward. She raised her trembling hand and knocked gently. Silence. She knocked again, slightly harder. Still nothing. Panic began rising in her chest. What if the old woman had died? What if she'd moved away? What if this opportunity was gone forever? Auntie Folek, she called softly, her voice cracking. It's me. It's Prisca. The door creaked open slowly. The elderly woman stood there, looking exactly as she had weeks ago, tired, worn, bent from years of hard labor. But her eyes were calm, unreadable, holding depths that Prisca had never bothered to notice before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lagos traffic hummed in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed despite the late hour. Then Prisca fell to her knees on the dirty concrete floor outside the door, tears streaming down her marked face, her carefully constructed pride shattering like dropped glass. I'm suffering, she sobbed, the words coming from somewhere deep and true. Everything you said would happen is happening to me. I've lost people who claim to love me. I've lost my beauty that everyone admired. I'm losing the comfort and security I took for granted. My father's business is collapsing. Nothing makes sense anymore. Auntie Folek looked down at her quietly, no triumph in her expression, only careful observation. I warned you, the old woman said simply. I spoke the truth you needed to hear. I know, Prisca cried, her voice breaking into pieces. I was cruel. I was proud beyond reason. I didn't see anyone but myself. I didn't value anyone's humanity. I treated people like they were less than insects, like their feelings didn't matter because they weren't beautiful or wealthy or important. She lowered her head until her forehead touched the dirty floor. Please, she whispered desperately. Tell me what to do. Tell me how to fix this. I'll do anything. The old woman's eyes softened slightly, but her voice remained firm, unyielding. Child, a curse born from the heart cannot be lifted by simple words or quick fixes. You cannot pray it away or buy your way out. Prisca looked up, fear naked in her eyes. Then how? She asked, her voice barely audible. How do I make this stop? Auntie Folek studied her for a long moment that felt like eternity. Then she spoke words that would change everything. You must walk the path of humility. You must serve those you once despised. You must learn genuine compassion where you once showed calculated cruelty. You must become, through action and genuine transformation, the opposite of everything you were. Only when your heart fundamentally changes will your chains begin to break. Only when you love others more than you love your reflection will you find freedom. Prisca's lips trembled. Her whole body shook. Whatever it takes, she said, meaning it for the first time in her life. Whatever you ask, I will do it. I don't want to be that person anymore. I can't be that person anymore. Auntie Folake stepped aside slowly, opening the door wider. Then enter, she said quietly. Your journey has just begun, and I warn you, it will be the hardest thing you've ever experienced. Prisca rose slowly from the dirty floor, her knees aching, her expensive clothes now simple covered in dust and grime. She stepped across the threshold into the tiny apartment. She didn't know it yet, but crossing that doorway meant crossing into a completely different version of herself. The hardest part of her life, and potentially the most transformative, was about to begin.